I'm Dr. S.K. Low, President of AAUC. Welcome to our monthly podcast series on building our collective American dream. In this July podcast, we focus on racial harmony, a goal for our collective American dream. In this increasingly individualized and polarized world, who doesn't want peace and harmony in our lives? Is racial harmony just an ideal, or can it be achieved? Does this Confucian Asian value of harmony elevate or harm us as Asian Americans? The flip side of harmony is distrust, hatred, strife, systemic discrimination, and how can these racial inequalities be leveled and racial distrust be unlearned? We are very fortunate today to have gathered a circle of experts and community activists to discuss the subject matter and how can we provide a long-term strategy to overcome racial discrimination and build harmony in our society so everyone can thrive. Let's go to Jack Hanna, our executive committee member and board member, as our host in this podcast.
Hello, I'm Jack Hanna, and I will be your host today. Our panelists include Dr. Raymond Douglas Chong, a sixth-generation Chinese-American civil engineer that has written, produced, and hosted dozens of books, poetry, music, and films on the history of the heritage of Chinese Americans. Also joining us today, Dr. Karen Umemoto, an MIT graduate and currently a UCLA professor of Asian American Studies, who has performed extensive research and writing on the context of social inclusion, participatory democracy, and political transformation. Also, we have Dr. Russell Jeung, a Stanford graduate and sociology PhD, is a San Francisco State University professor. His focus is community-based participatory research with Asian American communities and is nationally renowned for launching the Stop AAPI Hate Project last year, documenting violent hate acts across America. And lastly, we have Jonathan Leong, a successful commercial businessman and community activist from the San Francisco Bay Area. He founded the Asian American Donor Program in 1989, developing a database of bone marrow donors that is now in excess of 800,000 registrants. He founded and served as a board member of several community-based nonprofit organizations and business entities. Welcome, everyone. We're really happy to have you all join us. Our theme today is racial and social harmony, how that ideal and value has been an important identity of Asian Americans given the recent pandemic, the arbitrary violence perpetrated against Asian Americans. How can this cultural value of harmony be employed today to confront and resolve the conflicts that we face? Raymond, given your work involving media, has Asian harmony been revised? How important harmony is as far as Asian Americans are concerned?
My forefathers fled China because of the Civil War, the famine. So it's a desire for harmony. It's a false illusion that we have harmony in China. I believe it in the concept, but in practice, I don't see it in China and America.
Karen, what's your impression with regard to this idea of harmony?
I don't know that Asian Americans have any stronger sense of harmony than other people. Who doesn't want a harmony in the family? I think harmony is kind of a universal desire. And I agree with Raymond that it's less often a reality. I don't want to fall into that stereotype of Asians being this harmonious model minority. The idea of harmony has to be in sync with other values as well. So it's hard to have harmony when there's injustice, or it's hard to have harmony when there are unequal relationships, or it's hard to be in a harmonious relationship if someone's abusive. The idea of harmony is a worthy ideal to have, but there has to be the conditions for harmonious relationships. There are other cultures as well that there are kind of internal mechanisms or measures of harmony and balance. I don't think that that's specific to Asians or Asian Americans.
Russell, your take on this topic?
I agree with Raymond and Karen that harmony is an ideal and a value, but hasn't been fully lived out either on the individual level, the family level, the community, and the national level. We see disharmony and conflict throughout all these levels. Although it is a value at the individual level, you have a balance between your mind and your body. On the family level, there's integrated functions for people. On the community level, you should have reciprocity. And so I think both Taoist and Confucian thought overall promote harmony. But sadly, I think authorities use the notion of harmony to suppress any conflict, to maintain their privilege and power. And so the notion of harmony gets abused. The notion of harmony gets abused with the model minority myth thing that Asians are just passive and quiet, when in reality, we've always been fighting against discrimination. We have a strong legacy of resistance. Today, what's happening in terms of the Asian American community fighting back against racism is part of that long legacy. Like Karen said, the conditions are one of injustice and racism. So to get to that state of harmony, we need to resist, we need to raise our voices. Harmony is the goal in terms of racial justice, in terms of equality and equity, but harmony isn't necessarily the way to get to those objectives.
Thank you, Russell. Jonathan, your take on this topic.
If looking at harmony as a way to solve a problem, it's not going to happen here in this generation, because the problem is the Asian community is invisible because of the model minority. They're successful, they're smart, they'll get by. And that passes on all the way to the new immigrants and the refugees, and that's wrong. The Asian community is probably the poorest of all the minority communities in terms of financial, social, community needs. What touches everybody is the media. If the media can't portray the Asians as part of the community, then you're not. The reality is that you're still invisible. Unless you're the Asian community, step forward and get involved outside your community. If you can't sit at the table, then you are invisible. If you're at the table, they have to ask you for your opinion. They have to ask you because you're there.
I think your reference was to Malcolm X's quote that if you're not sitting at the table, you're on the menu. Karen, how that need to be taken on by community activists to redefine the model minority myth?
I think there are two issues that I heard. One is the issue of immigrant assimilation, and the other is the relationship between violence and community harmony. There's the Chicago School of Sociology, whose theories that the normative value is assimilation, that immigrants should come over, shed all of their cultural values and frameworks of thought and blend in to become fully American so that we are indistinguishable. And I think one of the things that we've been fighting for in ethnic studies is a better understanding of all of our histories and all of our unique cultural traditions, values, worldviews, so that people can live in a more pluralistically equitable society where people can accept one another for who we are. In the first grade, it was a rainy day and a kid threw sand in my face. And because Japanese was my first language, not because I'm an immigrant, but because my grandmother babysat me, I yelled out in pain in Japanese. And for that, I was put in the closet by my first grade teacher. I remember I could still smell the mustiness of the wet coats in the closet that leaves scars on all of us. And it made me feel ashamed for a while of my grandmother, made me want to quit Japanese school. It does things to people when we feel like to be in harmony, that we have to be invisible in terms of our cultural uniqueness. On the issue of youth violence, what we did in the book was really try to flip it, to look at the violent legacies of the US and look at the ways in which youth are confronting systems of violence. And if they act in any violent way, they're looked at as the problem, as opposed to looking at the problems that led to any violent action. We really have to try to start flipping the narrative so that when we think about addressing these issues, that we're not just addressing the behavior of the youth, but we're really trying to address the systemic problems that have led to violent actions. That really starts with the system having more harmony and safety in our communities.
Russell, what's your thoughts on what Karen has said and redefining cultural, personal, and community identities?
Like Karen's answer, I want to flip the question. We don't necessarily need to redefine our communities and what it means to be Asian, but we need to redefine what it means to be American. So This issue of anti-Asian violence isn't an Asian American issue. It's a national issue of racism and violence. I think we need to re-see America as a place of harmony, a place of inclusion, so that even if you are a foreigner, you can still be accepted and received and treated with dignity. I don't think the model minority stereotype is the problem of racism right now that's facing Asian Americans. It's really the stereotype of being perpetual foreigners. It's the flip side of being the model minority. People aren't beating up our grandmas because they're so smart. They're beating up grandma because they see her as not belonging, as not fitting into the neighborhood, of not speaking English well enough. The lived experience of a lot of working class immigrant Asians is that of the perpetual foreigner, where they are not treated as belonging, as they're seen as different. We know America treats foreigners really badly. America needs to flip its narrative about who belongs, flip its approach and treatment of foreigners, and again, flip that narrative that Asians are perpetual foreigners, that we belong. And even if we are immigrants and foreigners, we still belong no matter what. We need some cultural change. And it's not just fighting against the stereotype. We need more stories about Asians, Americans. The more we become human, the more people see the different aspects of our lives, then we no longer are objects or stereotypes. We become people. The way to fight stereotypes, again, isn't just trying to be the opposite of the stereotype. You're still playing into it. It's to have multiple stories.
Thank you, Russell. Raymond, are you in agreement?
I'm totally in agreement. It's always been systematically against the people of color. It's not an Asian thing. It's not a Black thing. It's all people of color. And it's been endemic. So it's a paradigm shift in how we are educated to tell the truth. I believe in the American Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, but it's still a fallacy that is not applied in reality. I believe in that dream, the American dream, but it has not been applied in our reality now.
Thank you, Raymond. Jonathan, your response to those comments about...
I totally agree with what Russell said. And so how do you change that? What's the bottom line here? Media creates their image and creates the world that has to be changed. The media needs to tell the story, and not the stereotype story, but what the true story is. We live in the same community. We want to succeed just like everybody else. Okay, but we look different. So that's the problem. We look different. That's why we're going to be the forever minority and forever immigrant.
So, Karen, let me go back to you. I really love the way that you flipped the question and the concept.
Thank you. I'm ultimately an optimist, and I have a lot of faith in people. And I think harmony starts at the heart. You can't have harmony without compassion and empathy, and you can't have compassion and empathy without understanding. And so as an educator, I think Russell and I are very active in trying to get Asian American studies promoted within the school systems from K through 12 to college and lifelong learners. It's only within the schools systems that we have a chance, as well as popular media, to really educate the American public about our histories, our contributions, our values, our struggles, the contemporary issues that we face, and to be able to have people be able to relate to those experiences, to empathize with those experiences, and then to be able to better understand like the role that we played in American society, from building the Transcontinental Railroad to the fishing industry on the West Coast to a lot of the agriculture in the Central Valley. Asians have played such a tremendously important role in the development of this country. And it's just very ironic that people are hating on Asians right now when people have been here for several hundred years contributing. So one of the things that we're working on and Russell's involved in is the Asian American Studies Center, for which I'm the director. We're launching a digital textbook on Asian American studies. And we want to have digital Asian American studies textbook so that anyone in the world with a computer internet connection could have free knowledge of Asian Americans and free curricular materials, and that any teacher can share Asian American studies scholarship and knowledge with their students. If we can get our histories integrated into the school systems, then that gives us the best shot at addressing these problems of racism and inequality.
Russell, your thoughts about education being a means by which the majority community reevaluates its assumptions, prejudices with regard to communities of color, be it Asian or otherwise.
That's the issue of the debate around the critical race theory, right? What are we educating our young people regarding race? Is it that America is not a racist society, that racism was in the past, that it's not institutionalized? Or do we help people have a good critical perspective about the systemic nature and the historical nature of racism, how it's institutionalized? Karen and I really want to promote ethnic studies K through 12 so that people do get an understanding of the contributions that different groups have made, and also the hardships, because I think we've all gone through different hardships in the United States. Most ethnic groups, most immigrant groups, certainly indigenous groups have gone through difficulties. As we understand the struggles that we've had, then we could actually, like Karen said, develop that compassion and empathy that we need to improve race relations. The only way to get to racial harmony is if we understand each other and empathize with each other, and also understand how certain groups face racism that impacts them as individuals. We do think that people can be educated, that people learn racism, and so people can unlearn racism, and people could be educated to have racial empathy and solidarity. And that's our hope. That's what we're working towards. Hate crimes legislation addresses racism at the tail end when someone's already committed a crime and someone's already been a victim. We want to prevent racism through education.
Well, we are making that change. We're articulating that vision of what an American dream is, what our society should be. So we got to be balanced and recognize we are brothers and sisters among people of color. We have the same mission of a better America in a multicultural society.
Education is the primary link. I totally agree with Russell and Karen. When I was with the White House Commission, when we were in the Department of Education, I told them, hey, you got to rewrite your history books. You have to look at racism. It's real, but how do you become part of the solution to whatever answer that this country is looking for?
My final question here. What is your thoughts about developing political and cultural coalitions with other communities in order to construct a society that doesn't view its citizens through the lens of race?
It's a must. Nothing happens with the voice of a single individual. Any kind of change has to be a collective change with collective impact. Change has to be built on a shared vision. There are specific challenges that Asian Americans face because we're always used as the wedge between Blacks and other people of color. That's one of the biggest challenges we face politically. And there is a racial hierarchy. Different Asian ethnic groups and national groups have different places on that hierarchy. Some are higher than others. There's just a lot of solidarity work that we have to do because we're often used as a wedge. Solidarity is built through struggle, that those kind of bonds of solidarity and really deep friendships are created when you're fighting together for the same thing. I have a lot of hope that we could learn from the past and many successful campaigns that we could draw upon to guide us moving into the future.
How do we build a movement for real change? The Stop AAPI hate movement has made real concrete changes just in the last year. That Asian Americans have come together pan-ethnically, seeing themselves as Asian. They're being treated as sort of a lumped together group. It's sort of a paradox. We're invisible in that black-white binary. We were omitted, but we're hypervisible, being seen as foreigners and getting attacked. And I think Asians experiencing it now have really stood up and have galvanized a mass movement through social media, through coming together and fighting the racism, because they know that's how they gain power. That's why Congress passed hate crimes legislation. That's why President Biden has issued executive orders to expand civil rights protection. That's why this week, California just signed a historic API equity bill. And that money doesn't just fight racism. It recognizes that Asians and Pacific Islanders face inequities in health, in education, in a lot of areas, and it provides $156 million to community groups. That's historic. That's power to get this amount of funding, and that came through a coalition of 150 Asian American groups. We now know how to build power. We've learned from previous movements, from ethnic studies, from the fight for Vincent Chin, from fighting Islamophobia, learning from Black Lives Matter and other communities of color. We've been using our collective perspective, our desire for harmony, mobilizing on behalf of our elders. A lot of people are outraged to see our elders are attacked, and that's why they're standing up against the racism. This last year, I've been really angry about the racism that we've been experiencing, but I've been heartened by the solidarity and the allyship we received from other communities of color, and heartened to see the Asian American community come together to fight racism.
I totally agree. We need a coalition to get stronger, we're united, and it's going to be a long road. For us Chinese, we've been around since 1849, at least for my forefathers, and we're 7 generations, we're still recognized as strangers from a different shore. It's this perpetual foreigner, modern minority myth. We have to be acculturate, assimilate, that we're all Americans together. We got to fulfill that lofty American dream. And we got to work with the Africans, the Hispanics, indigenous natives, all people of color that we're united. We got to have a seat at the table.
I've learned a lot of lessons from the Jewish community, how the Asians can organize and get into the middle of things and become part of things. The call of action to me would be, I challenge every one of you to get out of the choir, go out there and get involved, get on boards of non-Asian organizations. Well, you need to go to meetings that there are no Asians and you might be the only 1 or 2 that's in there. Then I would say you can start making a difference, because people that are not like you will look at who you are, understand what your values are. I suggest you participate in the highest level you can. You have to get into the community and get into the business community, the political community, every one of them.
My deep appreciation to our host, Jack Hanna, and our outstanding guests, Professor Karen Umemoto, Professor Russell Jeung, Dr. Raymond Chong, and Dr. Nathan Leong, who provided their critical insight in this important topic of racial harmony and what our communities have done and can do to achieve racial equality. Listening to this podcast, my main takeaways are: harmony is not a unique Asian concept and ideal. Harmony tend to stereotype Asian American as the silent minority. Racial equality, empathy, and understanding are preconditions to racial harmony. Education, active engagement in civic matters, accurate media portrait of Asian Americans are paths to reach racial harmony. We are happy to learn that progress is being made in Asian American studies in school, and coalitions are being formed to address the racial disparity. The AAUC podcast is supported by our active individual and organization members. For more information about AAUC, please go to our website asamunitycoalition.org. Thank you for listening to our AAUC podcast series on building our collective American dream. Please subscribe and comment on our podcast. Do tune in to our next episode, which will be aired on the last Sunday, August 29th, at 8 p.m. Eastern Time.